Hi, I'm Holly.
I'm Rob.
I'm Steve.
Welcome to Wine Time PA.
Welcome to our introductory podcast. In this episode, we are going to explain a bit about the podcast, a little about each of us, and what to expect from each episode. The three of us all live in central Pennsylvania. Holly and I are married and have always enjoyed visiting wineries and doing wine tastings together.
Very true. In fact, one of our first dates was we went to a bunch of wineries and did a wine tasting, and we eventually got married at a winery.
We really enjoy all of the social aspects, meeting other wine enthusiasts, hearing about the wines they love, learning about the wineries themselves. We met Rob and realized we share that common interest.
I was first introduced to wine at a friend's wedding where I served as their best man. As a wedding gift to them, we spent an afternoon exploring a wine trail together and sampling many excellent wines. And from there, my love of wine started to grow. Throughout the years, I've had many friends who love wine come and go in my life. In recent years, I learned that Steve and Holly also love wine, so I invited them to join me on a local drinking trail, as well as to attend some informal wine classes. Since then, we have been enjoying lots of wines and exploring the many great wineries found throughout Pennsylvania.
Yeah, we've all kind of become big wine hobbyists, and we found ourselves about once a month heading out to a winery, whether it's a new place or one that we visited before. And during the visits, we started listening to some podcasts because it was kind of a nice way to kill time. There are some really good ones out there that explain things such as wine making, wine terms, how to read a label, and so forth. There's a huge wealth of wine information readily available if you're interested in various forms of media.
But we noticed a void when listening to these podcasts.
We did. And I know that some wineries were mentioned, some of the details about those places were limited. When people found out about our hobby, they started asking us questions about the winery visited, such as how the tastings worked, what kind of wines did they offer, could you spend an afternoon hanging out there? And basically we just said, why don't we form a podcast where we can address those frequently asked questions that we got? Plus, honestly, let's face it, Pennsylvania kind of has a lack of recognition when it comes to wines. I'll even admit myself, several eons ago, and I won't say how old to reveal my age, Pennsylvania wineries aren't exactly my go-to wines. However, there's been a real shift, and there are a lot of wonderful wines being produced in our home state. Not to mention the wineries themselves, they're becoming just really awesome places to hang out on the weekends. Other parts of the U.S. get mentioned for their wines, so we kind of want to focus on Pennsylvania and shed some light on our wineries.
Before we continue, we should mention that none of us are wine experts. We are not sommeliers, and none of us work in the industry. We just consider ourselves your everyday wine drinker. We know some of the terminology, the winemaking process, but only a small part. We consider ourselves wine hobbyists and enthusiasts. We appreciate and enjoy all types of wine, from whites to reds, dries to sweet.
Absolutely, Rob. We really just consider ourselves aficionados. We understand enough to have a conversation about wine, and when we continue to learn about wine. But as you said, we're definitely not experts.
Now let's talk about the structure of our podcast and what you can expect. Each episode will focus on one Pennsylvania winery. We will start with mentioning where it is located, along with any other locations they may have. We may talk about when they opened, a brief history of the winery, and if known, we will mention if they have estate wines, which means they grow their own grapes, or if the juice comes from somewhere else. We will then let you know if reservations to visit are required, and then roughly the time frame that we visited the winery. We know that things can change at the wineries throughout the year, especially the wine availability. A lot of wineries have their everyday menu, but many offer seasonal ones throughout the year. Hopefully, any wines that we mention that sound appealing are available should you go yourself, but that is never a guarantee.
Next, we will talk about the winery itself, its aesthetics and style. This will give you a feel for the setting before you arrive. For instance, is there indoor or outdoor seating? Is this a place you can hang out with friends for an afternoon? Then we will get to how the tasting works. How many do you get to try? Are there preset flights, or do you get to customize them?
And then we'll give a range of the wines, roughly how many wines they have in the different varieties. An example we may say is this winery offers 50 wines. Out of that 50, there's 5 dry reds. There's 10 dry and semi-dry sweet white wines, maybe a couple blushes, and the rest are sweet or fruit wines. We'll also note the price range of their bottles at the time of our visit, just so you get an idea of how much it might cost. And finally, we're going to get into the good stuff, talking about the wines themselves. We will start off by discussing any wines that they sell that have won awards or some sort of recognition, as well as their best-selling wines. Then each of us is going to give you a few of our personal favorites and recommendations. We will try to note wines for those with dietary needs, such as gluten-free and low sugar, if the information is available. If we forget, we'll try to include that information in the episode notes.
Soon, each of us are going to talk about our personal wine preferences. We recognize that everyone's taste buds are different. What one person may love, another may hate. None of us would ever criticize someone for liking a wine that we may not care for ourselves. We all strongly believe when it comes to wine, drink what you love. It doesn't matter if it's a bone-dry, oak-aged red, or a super sweet ice wine. Life is too short to worry about what other people think is cool in the wine world. Just drink what you enjoy. We just want to mention our general favorites in wine so that you, the listener, can understand our palates a little and why we might recommend something. The three of us have a wide range of tastes that overlap in some areas but differ in others. But our hope is that you will find one of us that you feel your own personal taste aligns with in general.
We are like the people that recommend movies in the old days of video rental stores. And for all of you Seinfeld fans, I am personally a Vincent's Picks.
Good analogy, and hopefully our listeners know what a video rental is when they hear this. After we give our recommendations, we will discuss other drinks that the winery may have available. They may include both alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages. That way, if you're visiting the winery with somebody who doesn't care for wine, they'll know what options are available for them, or also if you have a designated driver who doesn't want any alcohol at all.
We jokingly gasp when someone says they don't care for wine, but we know it's not for everyone.
We will also talk about food options, if they offer any food or snacks, if you're allowed to bring in your own food or outside beverages, and then we'll wrap up our discussion about the winery with any other information we feel noteworthy, like events they host, live music offerings, or anything else that distinguishes them.
As far as when to expect a new episode, we are currently planning for once a month. We plan to drop a new episode the first Wednesday of every month. We picked Wednesdays because of Wine Wednesday. If you're not familiar, Wine Wednesdays is an unofficial weekly holiday where some wineries, bars, and restaurants offer deals on wine. Also, this gives you, the listener, a few days before the weekend to plan any wine excursions. We are only releasing new episodes once a month because, as we said before, none of us work in the wine industry. We all have other full-time jobs, and we want to make sure we can dedicate a proper amount of time to each winery we are featuring.
We are also doing this to document our journey as we explore the hundreds of wineries the state of Pennsylvania has to offer. We should also note, and you will probably hear us say this every episode, that we are not being paid by any of these wineries to promote or endorse them. We are personally selecting the wineries we want to visit, and all the opinions we give are our own. If at some point a winery were to extend a personal invitation and offer us a benefit in return, we will be transparent and mention that in the episode. Also, besides the one episode per month, we are going to try and release a few special bonus episodes throughout the year. And they may or may not focus on a specific winery. We may do an episode where we visit a wine festival or do a wine trail and talk about that. We may even visit a winery in another state close by just to mix it up every once in a while.
We also have some fun ideas for specials, but we're going to keep that a surprise. Now let's get to the good part, the wine. Each of us is going to talk about our personal wine preferences and taste palates, and the wines in general we tend to gravitate towards. And maybe those we tend to skip from time to time. We may reference particular worldly wine regions just as another tool to help you understand our personal tastes and how they compare to your own. Let's start with reds. Rob, why don't you kick us off?
Of the three of us, I probably lean into dry red wines the most, though I know we can all enjoy and appreciate a dry red wine. Of the three of us, I'm usually the first to circle a dry red on my tasting sheet when we visit a winery. I favor those dry reds in the winter months, or if I'm having a nice steak or even a pasta dinner. When it comes to dry red wines, the top of my list, hands down, is Merlot. I love the oakiness of Merlots, though I don't want the Merlot to have too many tannins, but just enough that makes you want to come back for more. I also enjoy Petite Syrah, and although not typically found in Pennsylvania, I do enjoy a nice Chianti. I'm also a big fan of blended reds. But I'm starting to expand my palate and have been starting to try more Cabernet Sauvignons, Cabernet Francs, and Pinot Noirs. I'm finding I'm not a big fan of Chambersons, though I'm still learning and not sure what it is about that grape that I don't care for. However, if you blend a Chamberson with another grape, like say the Concord, I do find I like that. In addition, I love how wineries are starting to play around with blending fruits into the dry reds. In particular, I'm finding I like blackberry merlots a lot, even though I don't typically care for blackberries. As far as sweeter reds, I don't often seek those out. Sure, I will have a glass here or there, but overly sweet wines I tend to avoid. However, there is one exception that I found recently, and that is Fredonia. Fredonia wine tastes similar to Concord, well, because they are related grapes, but I find Fredonias are just a tad less sweet than their Concord relatives. I will say this, visiting wineries with Steve and Holly has been a great way for me to try and find other wines that I may not have otherwise tried in the past. One in particular that I have started to enjoy, and I know Holly will mention, is Malbec. So Holly, why don't you tell us about your red wine preferences?
Sure, thanks, Rob. So when it comes to reds, I do prefer them dry. While there is the occasional sweeter red that I will like and drink, I usually want my reds with those medium to full body and those tannins, but not the tannins that are so big that I feel like I need a sip of water after every drink. And for those of you that don't know what I mean when I say tannins, I'm talking about that dry feeling in your mouth that you get from certain reds. Merlots tend to have a lot of tannins, which is probably one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of them. Sorry, Rob. But I do tend to skip it, but I do love them when they're part of a blend. I really love a good red blend. As Rob was talking about blends as well, I think it's really awesome how creative and artistic winemakers can be when they start blending grapes together. It results in some amazing things for your palate. Wines that are not blended, I would say my favorites are a tied number 3 between Syrahs and Chambersons. Number 2 is definitely Cab Sauvignon for me. I feel like most wine drinkers enjoy a good Cab, and it's a go-to for many. I tend to be prone for the ones from California if I'm not picking from Pennsylvania wine. But my number 1 go-to dry red, as Rob had mentioned, is Malbec. I absolutely love Malbecs. If I see one on a tasting sheet when we visit a winery, it is one of the first things I am checking off that list to try. Though I've tried some of the wines in the past, I'm definitely prone from Malbecs that come from Argentina. And usually if I'm buying one for the house, it's from Argentina, as Steve can attest to when it comes to the dry reds in our house, and I'll let him talk about his.
Absolutely. For me, it's more about what I don't like. And unfortunately, with reds, that's oak. A little oak is fine. A lot of oak is usually a hard pass. One such red I'm just not a fan of is Merlot, to Rob's dismay. Although there are always exceptions to that. Chamberson is a good example of a red wine I enjoy, which often does see a bit of oak. I love the fruit-forward flavors mixed with that drier finish. It's just more and more loving those Chamberson blends that are becoming popular in Pennsylvania. Probably due to that versatility of the grape and the availability and success of growing it in Pennsylvania. Syrah is another red I tend to try whenever I see it available at a tasting. I love those bolder flavors with subtle notes of fruit and that peppery spice finish. One of my absolute favorites is Concord, though. It's probably from growing up loving grape juice as a kid. I genuinely just love the Concord from start to finish, but I don't often drink a lot simply because Concord just tends to be a little too sweet for me. As Rob has said, Fredonia is another good example where it kind of gives me the different notes and familiarity with Concord, but having a bit of a drier finish. So it just has a more balanced flavor to it all around. Like the other two, I'm always on the lookout for a good red blend, where the winemaker just takes you on a ride, especially when they take like a sweet, fruit-forward grape and it meets a drier, bolder grape with a little tannins.
Yeah, those are good finishes. And I'm sorry, Rob, I feel like we gang up on you when we're saying how much we dislike Merlots.
Again, they're not for everyone, and I'll gladly drink my share of them.
All right, so I'll lead us on to the whites. Like my reds, my choice of whites is more about what I don't like. And with whites, that's high levels of acidity. Chardonnay is a wine that I'm kind of hit or miss with. And when I really enjoy them, It's unoaked, just like my preferences with reds. Riesling, on the other hand, is almost always a win for me. The fruit-forward flavors with that bit of acidity and a little dryness in the finish is just a perfect balance. Riesling is a wine that I could just drink all day long, especially when you get it in the semi-dry variety. I never pass up an opportunity to try a German or an Alsace Riesling. I also try not to miss an opportunity to try its German cousin, the Gewürztraminer. Moscato is a white that I thoroughly enjoy, though, especially those from northern Italy. While Moscato is a bit on the sweeter side, I just can't get enough of that orange blossom fragrance, which translates into these wonderful and unique tastes in the wine. Orange is one of my absolute favorite flavors overall, so it's not really a surprise that I like this in Moscato. I also do like a nice sweet white from time to time. Cayuga, Niagara, Diamond, those are some of my favorites, but like reds, I don't drink more than a glass of a sweeter wine at a time. I tend to think of them more as an ice wine, and I just sort of sip them. I also tend to be a little bit more adventurous with my whites, and I'm nearly willing to try anything. Dry, sweet, so long as it isn't too acidic. Rob, how about you tell us about your palate?
Overall, I tend to gravitate toward white wines nearly year-round, mostly because I find they are more versatile and compare with more food options, but partially because I just find I like white wines. Among the many varieties of wines, I favor what I call the German wines. I think it's safe to say that all three of us enjoy good Riesling, and I do as well. I do favor the German-style Rieslings over the American-style, but most American-style Rieslings are very excellent, especially in that semi-dry like Steve had mentioned. There are two grape varietals related to the Riesling that I especially enjoy, Traminet and Gewürztraminer. I enjoy the balance between the sweeter, fruit-forward of these two grapes with the hints of citrus and a little bit of acidity. Traminets, Gewürztraminers, Rieslings, as well as some other wines like the Vignoles, tend to have a nice balance between that fruit-forward and citrusy acidity that I really like. Plus, these wines pair very well with spicy foods, which I tend to enjoy. But these are wines that are also excellent on their own, especially chilled on a nice summer day. I tend to shy away from Chardonnays, but I'm usually willing to give them a try. And I don't particularly like overly acidic wines like Steve had mentioned, in particular Pinot Grigio, but I will give them a try. In recent trips to the wineries, I'm finding I'm starting to enjoy Sauvignon Blancs, though I admittedly prefer Sauvignon Blancs that come from New Zealand as opposed to here in the United States. But speaking of high acidic wines and Pinot Grigio in particular, Holly, I know that's one of your favorites, so why don't you tell us about your white wine preferences?
Of course. I say bring on the acid. All these acid haters, but when it comes to wine, I like the acidity. And listeners, you can't see me rolling my eyes at them when they're dissing the acidity in a white wine. I really like that. For years, I would say I was a red wine drinker, but that has really shifted for me in recent years, and I am definitely more about the white wines. Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, as Rob had mentioned, is definitely one of my go-tos. It's another one like Malbec that if I see it on a tasting sheet, I'm going to be checking it to trying it. I've also been really big on Sauvignon Blancs as well, especially those from New Zealand, but I've been trying them a lot more. I actually think I've been drinking them a lot lately in the last few weeks compared to some other ones. As far as other whites go, I've really been finding that I've been enjoying the Gruner Veltliner grape. It's a really interesting, versatile grape that's popping up a lot in our region, and I really like seeing that on tasting sheets and seeing what winemakers are doing with it. I'm really prone to the Semillon grape as well, I've found in my taste palettes. And I'm split on Vidal Blancs. I've been playing with them a little bit more. Sometimes I really like them. Sometimes they're a little too sweet for me. As both Rob and Steve had mentioned, Rieslings are just this incredibly versatile grape and wine. And just like the two of them, I just love trying a good Riesling. I'm also prone to the ones from Germany because I love those fruit forwardness in Rieslings, especially compared to the petrol. But sometimes that earthy, minerally from the Riesling and the petrol mixes so well and makes a really great versatile grapes. A few years ago, I was big on Moscatos, and I still do like a really good Moscato, but it's not one of the ones I go out of my way to taste like I used to a few years ago. I usually get them if I'm in feeling a sweeter mood, maybe after dinner or something on a hot day. I might say, let's get a Moscato. And if I'm buying a bottle, I'm probably going to buy one that Steve likes because I know that he's more than likely going to drink more of that bottle than I'm going to drink it.
Absolutely.
And another sweeter white wine that I really enjoy are ones made with the diamond grape. I've been finding we've had some really great wineries here in Pennsylvania that are doing some beautiful things with that diamond grape that I enjoy. Finally, when it comes to whites, I'm not a big Chardonnay fan either, but I have been experimenting with it more. I don't mind the oak. I know that Steve doesn't like it, but I don't mind it. I like the butteriness. I know it's a staple kind of wine that a lot of Pennsylvania winemakers are doing some interesting things with. I found a few that I actually really enjoy in our tasting trails, but I'm not sure if I would ever buy a bottle just yet of a Chardonnay, but we'll see. Unless it's champagne or sparkling wine, because Chardonnay is used a lot in those wines, and I am a big fan of sparkling wines, and I will use that to segue into talking about sparkling wines. Overall, out of three of us, I am the one that probably likes sparkling wines the most. The other two aren't, I don't think, big fans, and they seem like they're agreeing with me. In Pennsylvania, you can't call them champagne because they don't come from France. You have to come from the Champagne region of France to be called a champagne, so they're just called sparkling wines on the tasting menus here in Pennsylvania. I do tend to like them a little sweet, not super bone dry. I like the carbonation with the sweetness. There's something fun and fizzy about that. I don't drink them as often as non-sparkling wines, but I usually will crave a bottle of something fizzy every couple months and want to pull one out and put it in the fridge, which is something Steve can attest to as I turn it over to him to talk about sparkling wines.
Yeah, thanks. With sparkling wines, I do tend to like the traditionally slightly sweeter wines like Holly because the carbonation tends to increase that sense of bitterness, and that creates a nice compromise between the two. Moscato d'Asti is a perfect example. While I tend to think Moscato is a little too sweet, when carbonated, that sense of bitterness of the carbonation brings down that sweetness and maintains all those wonderful flavors and makes the wine feel a bit more balanced to me. So when I do look for a good sparkling, that interplay between the carbon dioxide and the sweetness is what I'm really looking for.
No, I agree with that. I think that's a good analogy. I think you summed up how I feel about it better, though. I don't mind if my sparklings are a little drier. I just don't want them bone dry. Rob, what do you think about sparklings?
I will keep my comments rather brief on sparklings, as I don't particularly care for sparkling wines. Sure, at a formal event like a wedding or special occasions, I'll have a glass. But in general, I don't seek out sparkling wines. Having said that, I have been finding that wineries are taking their super sweet fruit wines and playing around with sparklings. And there's been a few of those that I've come across that I tend to enjoy. Maybe not necessarily enough to buy a whole bottle of it, but something about taking those super sweet fruit wines, putting that little bit of fizz in there and paring down that sweetness, it's not bad. And like I said, I'll have an occasional glass here or there, but probably not enough to go out and buy a bottle on its own.
I have noticed that you'll try a nice sweet wine when it's on tap, and they have to use just a subtle amount of carbonation for the system to work. And it's not quite a normal sparkling, but it's just that little bit.
Yeah, when there's just a little bit of the fizz, it's not bad. And I can enjoy that.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that there's something fun about when they take sweeter wines and add that carbonation that kind of lowers that sweetness and makes it a little bit more tolerable, I guess is the right word I'm looking for there.
Yeah, but just in general, it's not a particular brand of wine that I'm going to be seeking out and diving headfirst into all the sparklings. But again, I will play around with them and do enjoy them because there are some uniquenesses in the sparkling world out there. But now let's change gears and talk about a different category of wine, namely rosés and blushes. A few years ago, I would say that rosés were high on my list of favorite wines. But the more I've learned about wines and the more wines I've tried, I have found rosés to be hit or miss. If I'm completely honest, I think a lot of that is just due to a lack of knowledge I have about these wines. Rosés can be made from a variety of grapes, and so knowing which grape the rosé is made from can determine whether or not you may or may not like it. Rosés can also span the spectrum from dry to sweet, so for me it's finding that right balance of fruity flavors, but not being overly sweet, but also not being bone dry as well. But I will sample rosés whenever I get a chance, And there's one kind of rosé that I do enjoy, and I know Steve's going to talk about it more, and that's the Pink Catawba. So, Steve, tell us about your rosés.
I'm still trying to figure out rosés, to be honest, as well. But as you mentioned, Pink Catawba. I will always try a Pink Catawba. It's one of those rare places where Rob and I are in complete agreement about wine. Well, generally, they are a touch too sweet. I just absolutely love that flavor. Probably because there is a little bit of tartness that complements that sweet. And while you can get the Catawba in a white also, that little bit of skin contact just really rounds out the flavor for me and introduces a bit of structure in the finish. This is another wine that where that light bit of carbonation I think can really enhance the flavor by cutting that sweetness. On to you, Holly, because I really don't have enough knowledge about rosés at this point to say anything else constructive.
Right. Rosés and blushes are typically not a go-to wine for me, and somehow it feels really wrong to say that because as a woman, I am supposed to love rosé all day, and that's just not me. But I will try them, especially if they're made with a red grape that I like. Like, I've stumbled across a few Malbec rosés, and I've always found those kind of enjoyable to try. If I do find a pink-colored wine that I like, it does tend to be the sweeter side. I don't go as nuts for the Pink Catawbas as the two of you do, but I will try them, and I do find that there are some out there that are really nice to have a glass of. And I also recently tried a rosé Grenache from France that I found really enjoyable. I was surprised by that. But it was more of an acidic, dry white that I think it reminded me of than it did a rosé, which is probably why I liked it so much. But yeah, otherwise, I don't have too much to say about rosés either. And why don't we just talk a little bit about fruit wines, because Pennsylvania is really known for their fruit wines as well. And I'll start by saying eons ago, when I got into wine, I tried a lot of fruit wines. I think when I first started visiting Pennsylvania wineries, I went to the sweet side of the menu with the fruit and the sweeter wines, and I've kind of avoid those more so now than I used to, but I will. I do love eating fruit. I have a huge sweet tooth, but I tend to want to save my sweets for actual desserts and not wine. I find that fruit wines can be a little too sweet for me. Don't get me wrong, there's some amazing wineries out there who make fruit wines. They do a good job of getting that fruit flavor, but not making it taste like pure sugar. I use the analogy a lot that fruit and sweet wines are like a rich, decadent chocolate layered cake. Good for a few bites, but builds over time and can be a little too much after a while. A lot of times I'll have a small glass of a fruit wine or a really sweet wine as dessert after dinner. When I do find a fruit wine that I like, they tend to be peach or strawberry. I also enjoy a good cranberry wine, especially around the holidays, because they have that tartness. But I know Steve is a big fan of cranberry wines, so I'm going to let him talk about those.
Thanks. Yeah, like Holly, I also love eating fruit, and that translates into me liking fruit wines just for their pure flavor. But I also agree with Holly. The sweetness is a little bit overwhelming sometimes, so while I absolutely love trying them, I tend not to sit and just drink multiple glasses of fruit wines, even though that's how I got started with wines as well. I think back and I also tend to like the peaches and the berries. But as we continue on, when I find those really nice fruit wines that I enjoy, I tend to drink those like a dessert wine, like I'd mentioned earlier. And I'll just get a glass after a meal, and I'll just sip it over a bit of time and just really enjoy that little bit of sweetness as a dessert and really take in all those nice flavors and all that great fruit. One in particular that stands out, though, is cranberry, as Holly mentioned. And with that, it's all about the tartness. I just love the tartness that the cranberry brings into the wine, and that really helps balance the sweetness so it doesn't feel so high.
And you always try cranberry when we see it on a menu, usually.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's a cranberry on a tasting menu, it's definitely getting a check. I'm also probably the most likely in our group to try some interesting fruit wine that is unique to a winery or a fruit that's not often seen. Recently, I've seen huckleberry, elderberry, plum, and anything else less traditional. I'm going to give it a shot just because you never know. If it's a little bit more unique, I'm guaranteed to try it. And while I do really like fruit wine, I tend to like it blended with some of those drier reds, like Blackberry Merlot, which is an exception considering what I said earlier. That's just become this nice popular blend that I've seen around Pennsylvania recently, and the fruit and the Merlot grape just work splendidly together.
For me, with fruit wines, I tend to shy away from them just because they're mostly overly sweet, and I tend to shy away from the overly sweet wines. But it seems like the more wineries we visit, the more variety of fruit wines there are, just as Steve had mentioned. And they're definitely not my go-tos, but I will try them. And there are a couple exceptions, though, to fruit wines that I really do enjoy. First one is watermelon wines. I love a good watermelon wine, especially on a hot summer day if I'm sitting poolside or just outside relaxing. The other fruit wine I really enjoy is apple wines. I will almost always try an apple wine if it's on the menu. I've also found that some wineries, especially in the fall, will make a spiced apple wine by adding cinnamon and other spices into the wine. Those are usually good as well and worth a try, but in general, I tend to shy away from fruit wines, at least more than a glass. But there are a couple wines that I've been seeing and starting to play around with in the fruit categories, particularly mangoes. I've been finding the last few years I've been enjoying the mango flavor. I've been seeing mango wines popping up here and there across the Pennsylvania wineries, and so I will seek those out and try them just because they're a little unique, a little different, and I just really enjoy that mango flavor. And now we come to our last category. This is basically a miscellaneous or specialty wines. Think of things such as meads, ports, and ice wines fall into this last category. I will start us off by saying that of all the different categories we have talked about, this is one area I just avoid. If you like sweet wines, I highly recommend ice wines as they are often super, super sweet. As such, I will sample them, but I'm not sure if I've ever bought a bottle of ice wine. The same goes for port and meads. Ports tend to be too strong alcoholic-wise for me, and meads, I'm just not that into honey to make a wine out of it. Steve, do you have any thoughts on this category?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat with you, Rob. I love honey, but something about the fermentation process does something that I'm just not a big fan of. Well, I have found a good mead from time to time, and I actually really enjoy trying them just to, expand my palate. I can't remember ever having bought one, but I'm usually willing to give one a shot if I see something interesting. Port is probably the one place where I'm a little different. I'm usually willing to give a port a try compared to the two of you. But I've also probably never bought a bottle of them. I enjoy trying them, but for the same reason you mentioned, the alcohol content is a bit too high and tends to overwhelm some of the flavors of the grape itself, and it just sort of takes away from it. There have been a few that I have thoroughly enjoyed and even have gone back for a second tasting, but not enough that I really decided to buy. Ice wines are another one. I love trying them. They're so sweet, and when you get just a little tasting at a winery, it's just pure deliciousness. Some of the various fruits they use, the sweetness is so high. I've maybe bought 2 bottles in my life because I just can't imagine sitting down and drinking that much sugar. The residual sugar is just too high in the content, and delicious as they may be, they tend to be a little bit pricier, and I just don't want to waste my money, if that makes sense, on something that I'm probably not going to drink the whole bottle of, because it's going to just take too long for me to get through it, that I'm not going to really enjoy it this whole time.
I mean, I'm really not a fan, kind of in the same boat here with a lot of these specialty wines. Like the two of you, I do like honey a lot, but I don't necessarily like it when it comes into meads. And Steve had mentioned there's something that during that process, it just makes it a little too sweet for me, that I'm not a fan of it. I don't care for spirits in general. I'm definitely just not a liquor type gal. I mean, there's some places I will try and drink, but overall, and there's something when you add brandy or other things to wine that it just doesn't appeal to my palate in general. In the recent years, I think there maybe has been 1 or 2 port wines I've taken a few sips of, and I'm like, oh, you know what? That's not bad. But I would probably only be able to take 2 or 3 sips of that port wine before I'd be done with it. I do actually find the occasional dessert or ice wine that I don't mind sipping. But I'm going to go back to my chocolate cake analogy. It's one of those things where it just tends to be a little too sweet. I can probably just maybe have like a fourth of a glass, I would say, of it before I'd be done. So yeah, when it comes to those, they're my go-to or my favorite. I'll definitely always try them if they're offered to me and they sound interesting. But through the years, I can think of maybe one dessert wine I've bought, because as Steve had said, they tend to be a little bit more on the expensive side. And if they're not one I'm going to sit and drink a lot, I have no reason to try it. I think that summarizes our preferences. Does anyone else anything they want to add real quick before we talk about their personal preferences?
I think we pretty much covered all the wines that we like and what we tend to stay away from.
Yep.
Yeah.
And hopefully, between the three of us, you found kind of your Vince's, is that what it was? Vincent's picks, from our staff that you can, when we were listening to our episodes, you have that person that maybe you can kind of relate to a little bit. Just keep in mind, overall, our goal of this podcast is to share our journey as we explore Pennsylvania and the wines. It's our love of wine and our experience that we want to give to you so you know what to expect should you want to plan your own visit to these wineries and to our state if you're not from Pennsylvania. Keep in mind, we are located in central Pennsylvania. We're right in the middle of the state, which makes it great for us to get out and explore and visit various wineries, but we're kind of might be limited as to what we can do at any given time. We are going to try and do our best to feature wineries from different regions throughout the states of the year, but some regions may be harder to get to than others, especially during our first year when we're just starting out.
We hope that you'll tune in each month and share your feedback with us. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all under WineTimePA handle. You can also email us at winetimepa, all one word, @gmail.com. Thank you for listening.